Right, 50 years ago, after some 10 years practice, I was quite good at making plastic kit models of warships and naval aircraft. However, marriage, parenthood, and a naval career put paid to that adolescent hobby. And maybe someday. But meanwhile, I've retained an interest in ship models, not just admiring the skills of their makers and valuing them as enduring three-dimensional representations of vessels, which in most cases are now long gone, but also in their broader cultural significance. Hence this talk today, which is an expansion of an element of a talk titled Some Manifestations of the Imperial Japanese Navy in Contemporary Japanese Culture, which I first gave in 2017. I have a long-standing interest in Japan, especially in its modern history since the Meiji Restoration, and in the Imperial Japanese Navy in particular. My wife is interested in different aspects of Japanese culture, and we have made two-week trips to Japan. The first visit was in 2005, the centenary of the Battle of Tsushima, and also the anniversary of another notable naval battle, I forget which. I hadn't mentioned the Tsushima aspect before we left the UK, but fortunately there was a day while we were in Tokyo when my wife had arranged to meet Japanese teachers of mathematics. So I was allowed off on my own to see the preserved battleship Mikasa, Admiral Togo's flagship. When I had made known in advance my wish to see the Yamato model in the Kure Maritime Museum. Only a short excursion from Hiroshima, through which we were to pass anyway, but there was a degree of grumbling, only partly mollified by the promise of an all-day visit to a notable Japanese garden the following day. But as luck would have it, the day we were to visit Kure, it rained all day. Serious rain, because nothing in Japan is ever done in half measures. And my wife subsequently admitted there really had been no option other than to visit a museum. So we saw the model, which at 1/10 scale really is massive, just over 86 feet long, and at that scale could be extraordinarily finely detailed. For instance, the main armament gun barrel muzzles are actually rifled, true to scale, and the wooden deck is made up of some 4,000 true to scale ashwood planks. Of course, I took some photos, and as mentioned in the shipcraft softback, it's as well to have one or more people in the photos to convey the sheer size of the beast. Not a huge number of photos, however, because despite having made the pilgrimage to its shrine, I'm less interested in the ship itself, because its raison d'etre were outmoded, and reflecting that, Yamato achieved little of consequence during the war. Less interested in the ship itself than in the enduring cultural significance. That said, Yamato was, when completed in 1941, not just a good-looking ship, but the very model of a modern naval battleship. Arguably the best designed vessel of her type, although that type was outmoded. And the model illustrates certain interesting features of the ship which might otherwise be overlooked. For instance, great care was taken by the designers to minimize the damage that might be caused by the blast of the 18-inch guns. The boats were almost all the ship's boats were stowed in enclosed hangars below the upper deck, in this particular case to be brought out and lowered and recovered by means of an overhead railway. By 1945, as can be seen in these views, Yamato carried no boats whatsoever at upper deck level, nor are there any life rafts. Here's a closer look at the aviation arrangements. The IJN considered shipborne aircraft very important for reconnaissance and gunfire spotting, and Yamato carried 7 float planes, all normally stowed in a hangar below the upper deck and launched from the 2 catapults. The model was always intended to be of the ship at the time of her loss, of which more later, in April 1945. By then, she had a formidable number of anti-aircraft guns, 24 5-inch dual-purpose weapons in twin mounts, and over 150 25mm cannon. the latter almost all in power work triple mounts, most of which were enclosed to protect the crews from gun blast. Here, for good measure, is a photo from Shipcraft 14 of the midships AA batteries from the starboard side. The reality, however, was that Yamato would suffer the same fate as Prince of Wales and Repulse. She would be overwhelmed by the sheer number of attacking aircraft, and without fighter aircraft cover, no amount of anti-aircraft gunnery could have altered the outcome. Here's another photo from Shipcraft 14, which latter publication pointed me at the website of the Yamato Shipbuilding Company, which was established in 1929 adjacent to what was then the Kure Naval Arsenal, and by the end of the 20th century had some 80 years' experience of building and repairing small vessels. In particular, the firm had over 30 years' experience of building small vessels in steel, and hence got the contract for building the 1/10th scale model of Yamato, which in the event proved to be a daunting business. Getting the hull exactly right was far more difficult than anticipated. The hull form of the full-size ship had been quite complex, and nobody had ever had reason to build a small, the equivalent of between 1 million and 1.5 million pounds sterling, mostly provided by one wealthy donor. And I suspect the whole project only succeeded by virtue of a good deal of work by unpaid volunteers. These are pictures from the Yamato Shipyard Company website. As things happened, assembly of the frame began in mid-October 2003, and by the end of January 2004, the hull, fully plated and decked with 6mm steel plate, was complete. For me, the most interesting picture here is that at bottom right. On 1st of February 2004, the hull was launched from a slipway with full ceremony. This was, as mentioned in my first slide, to be more than just a model. Thereafter, the hull was immediately craned onto a barge for transport to the museum building, in which it was fitted out over the following 12 months. On 1st of February 2005, the model was complete. On 23rd of April that year, the Kure Maritime Museum, now widely known as the Yamato Museum, opened to the public. Why, however, was such an extraordinary object built? I've said more than once in the past that among the principal virtues of accurate ship models are their portability and their compact nature, which facilitates putting into one's mind's eye a three-dimensional overall view of the vessel represented. But the 1/10th scale model of what was in reality a very large warship is neither portable nor compact. And though extraordinarily detailed, it would, in my opinion, have been possible to show the same degree of detail in, say, 1/48th scale. I keep being drawn towards the seemingly irrational conclusion that a decision was made at some point to make a model of the Yamato, which was actually as large as was practically possible. And that, in my view, only makes sense in the context of what I think of as the cult of the battleship Yamato, a subject I shall soon return to. But for the moment, I'll suggest that it's not fanciful to consider the Yamato Museum model in the context of that postulated cult of the battleship Yamato as comparable with the giant Buddha at Nara in the context of Japanese Buddhism. The sheer size of both is impressive, intentionally so. So why a cult of the battleship Yamato, which, as I'll explain in due course, has taken a number of forms over the past 70 years or so? A general Japanese characteristic which I admire is their pride in the longevity of their society and its distinctive culture, which in the modern era determined that Japan resisted the economic and political subjugation which Europeans and Americans forced upon China in the 19th century. And from the late 1860s, the Japanese united under their emperor, rather than first ending imperial rule and subsequently fragmenting. which was the fate of China during the first half of the 20th century. From the early 1870s, the Meiji-era government promoted modernization and expansion of Japan's economy, and also established European-style armed forces, which for some 50 years from the early 1890s engaged in a series of expansionist conflicts to secure Lebensraum, natural resources and markets in a region which might otherwise have been dominated by Europeans and Americans. Of particular note in our context was Japan's development as a maritime and naval power from the early 1870s. Development comparable with that of Germany over the same period, but the Japanese wisely chose association and alliance with Britain rather than rivalry, and thus emerged from the Great War definitely first class in those respects. And having along the way humbled both Russia and Germany, the Imperial Japanese Navy, the IJN, was seen by many Japanese between the wars as an emphatic statement that they, unlike a good many other Asians, were not going to be pushed around by whites. A further consideration, and actually the predominant theme of today's Kure Maritime Museum, is that continued effort and innovation in shipbuilding and the associated industries prior to Japan's defeat in 1945 was of great importance as a foundation for her post-war economic recovery. National pride in the IJN was thereby well established prior to the attack upon Pearl Harbor in December 1941. Barely 6 months later, however, the Navy suffered the first of a string of defeats, and by August 1945 had been all but eradicated. Subsequently, in the early days of the US occupation, there was an over-enthusiastic determination that Japan should never again be a maritime power. But it was soon recognized that both geography and international politics dictated otherwise. From the time of the Korean War, the United States supported the idea of reviving a Japanese Navy, which was indeed re-established in 1954 as the Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Force, JMSDF, but which consciously maintained many of the traditions of its predecessor. Hardly surprisingly, for until the 1980s, the leading men within the JMSDF were all pre-1945 graduates of the Etajima Naval Academy. In the 1950s and 1960s, however, for both social and economic reasons, there was a degree of domestic opposition to development of the JMSDF, to counter which interested parties, in inverted commas, discreetly encouraged a number of initiatives intended to put the IJN in a favourable light, especially among teenagers and young adults who had no personal memory of the Imperial Navy. One such initiative was the production and marketing of ship model kits. Model making from kits as a hobby, almost entirely for boys, came to Japan with the US occupation forces. And in the late 1940s, mass-produced kits with the pieces cut from sheet balsa wood were available. In the 1950s, Tamiya and others began making and marketing such kits of Japanese warships, which at the time US and British manufacturers almost entirely neglected. Very soon, however, the first plastic scale models by the likes of Revell and Airfix, manifestly superior both in accuracy of detail and ease of construction, were imported. The Japanese firms which had invested in the machinery, etc., to make wooden ship models metaphorically sucked to their teeth, but soon appreciated that plastic was the future, and that there was potentially great domestic demand for kits of Japanese warships, despite the IJN having been decisively defeated only 10 or 15 years previously. It's stated in the Tamiya company history that having overcome considerable technical problems, the firm was ready in the late 1950s to manufacture its first plastic ship model. But which ship? The decision was simple, says the history, the battleship Musashi. Really? As things happened, their first plastic ship model was a 1/800th scale Yamato, the first of many of that ilk, although not all to that scale. By his own account, Tomiya Shinsaku conceived during a visit to Hamburg in 1967 the idea of modelling the whole IJN of the Pacific War period in constant scale waterline plastic kits, and subsequently persuaded other firms in Shizuoka, historically an important centre for the Japanese toy making industry, to participate in a cooperative venture to manufacture and market such models in a uniform 1/700th scale. An odd choice, perhaps made because nobody else used it, but the rest, as they say, is history. The firms concerned, principally Tamiya, Aoshima, and Hasegawa, continue to cooperate, which is a very typically Japanese characteristic, in marketing kits of well over 150 IJN warships, from mighty battleships down to supply ships and Yangtze River gunboats. And some 50 years after the series was first launched, they are continually issuing new kits or retooling older ones. As for Yamato itself, at least 50 separate Yamato kits were marketed in various scales by various manufacturers, predominantly Japanese, before the Kure Maritime Museum monster was built. So why Yamato? A ship which, due to wartime secrecy and its generally undistinguished war record, was unknown to most Japanese during its life of less than 5 years. While within the IJN, it had the derisory nickname Hotel Yamato on account of its inactivity. And I believe that to answer that question, one must consider not just the ship itself, and Yamato and Musashi were unquestionably by substantial margins the largest and most powerfully armed battleships ever built, but also its enduring post-1945 cultural significance within Japan. Firstly, there's the name itself. The province Yamato was the land of the early emperors, and thereby Yamato was an archaic name for their entire realm. Around the end of the first millennium AD, the term Yamato Damashi, commonly translated as Yamato spirit, was coined for the values, culture, etc., which were believed to be uniquely Japanese. More recently, the author Lafcadio Hearn wrote in the late 19th and early 20th centuries of that Yamato spirit. And the term was also much used by Japanese nationalists in the 30 years prior to 1945. In the immediate post-1945 period, therefore, it was familiar to all Japanese and also to foreigners with even a cursory understanding of Japanese culture. Secondly, there's the circumstances of her loss, the subject of a book titled Requiem for Battleship Yamato, written by one of her few surviving crew members, which was published in Japan in 1952. Put briefly, after the US landings on Okinawa at the beginning of April 1945, Okinawa is some 400 miles south-southeast of Kyushu, but nonetheless, as a prefecture of Japan, was considered to be home ground. After that invasion, what remained fully operational of the IJN combined fleet in Japanese waters, which was Yamato, one light cruiser and 8 destroyers, that force was ordered to attack the American invasion force. It was generally understood that this was effectively a suicide mission, not least because the force would have no fighter aircraft support. And Yamato was indeed sunk 100 miles south of Kyushu by US Navy aircraft, having been hit by at least 11 torpedoes and a number of bombs. There is no doubt that Yamato's crew put up a hard fight against overwhelming odds. The Japanese force was attacked by over 300 aircraft from a number of USN carriers. Musashi's crew had also put up a hard fight during the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944, when that ship was sunk by overwhelming air attacks. Musashi, however, was lost during a much larger combined fleet operation, from which the ship had a reasonable chance of returning home, as Yamato did. Whereas the poignant Requiem makes it clear that Yamato's crew knew their final operation would almost certainly be a one-way voyage, which few of them would survive. Nonetheless, they carried on regardless. They fought a hopeless battle, as the IJN had been doing since the end of 1942, but they did so valiantly, and in doing so epitomised the Yamato spirit, one much vaunted aspect of which was a warrior's determination to fight to the death in the face of great odds rather than surrender. An author writing of this particular 19th century print did remark that Japanese history and mythology are somewhat obsessed with heroic failure, and that during the artist's lifetime there was a great demand for his illustrations of undaunted heroism during Japan's medieval wars. 60 years on, that book, Requiem for Battleship Yamato, was the basis for a film made in 2005, whose title translates as Men of Yamato, and which focused upon the ship's final sortie. For the film, a full-scale replica was constructed of the ship's hull above the waterline and its superstructure up to the level of the 6-inch gun turrets. Though above that level, as noted in Shipcraft 14, imagery was actually of the newly completed Kure Maritime Museum model. Millions of Japanese saw the film. Some 400,000 actually visited the set to walk upon the decks. Returning to the cult aspect, by which I mean a subculture rooted in a historic reality, but subsequently developing a life of its own, back in the 20th century, Yamato boldly went where no battleship had gone before. In an anime TV series first broadcast in 1977, the wreck was salvaged, dare I say resurrected, and rebuilt as space battleship Yamato, a United Nations asset whose crew members are nonetheless explicitly stated to have mystically inherited the ethos and noble qualities of the IJN ships company, which had largely perished in 1945. Despite the bizarrely improbable plot and indifferent animation, space battleship Yamato gained sufficient following in Japan to spawn a string of sequels and remakes over more than 30 years. More recently, in 2013, an online free-to-play computer game was launched in Japan, featuring Fleet Girls, cuties personifying IJN ships of the Pacific War period, ships being she, of course. Don't ask me to explain it. Visit the Wikipedia page Kantai Collection or search for the word Cancol on YouTube. The parent company of Kantai Collection is among the supporters of the Kure Maritime Museum, as one might expect. And of course, the game was a front for what subsequently developed into a sizable franchise, including game cards, manga, TV, cinema, anime, etc., etc. But I'll draw your attention to the silhouette of a Yamato-class battleship in the top left-hand corner of this slide. While here is Yamato herself, like all of the characters personifying IJN battleships and heavy cruisers, well armed and with prominent superstructure, which raised a laugh when I gave the original talk and occasioned the comment, "Mark Brady's always good for a laugh." Just the one. In conclusion, it's not hard to find pictures of the model on the wonderful World Wide Web, and I commend Seaforth's publication Shipcraft 14. But if you ever go to Japan, do visit the Kure Maritime Museum. It's just a short train trip from Hiroshima, which is on the main bullet train line from Tokyo to Nagasaki. We, the Brits, have preserved HMS Victory, HMS Caroline, HMS Belfast, HMS Cavalier, but only because they happened to survive, and we then leave them out in the rain. The Japanese, meanwhile, have built this magnificent model commemorating what they considered the best of the Imperial Japanese Navy, and having housed it well, can expect it to remain on display for at least 100 years. Probably a great deal longer. There's food for thought.